This episode is sponsored by Ember. I drink my coffee slow, and I'm picky about what I like to drink my coffee out of, but maybe that's just me. Some mugs keep your coffee so hot you can't even drink out of it without playing a guessing game with the lid off and on, and other mugs just don't keep the coffee hot. Ember keeps your coffee at the temperature you want it, so it's at drinking temperature every time. Get 10% off an Ember mug with the code COFFEEPOD on ember.com. You're listening to the Coffee Podcast. This is the Coffee Science Series, an introduction to the coffee seed sector.
Kibet Langat, coffee farmer from Kichawir Farmers Cooperative Society in Kericho, Kenya. I'm one of the farmers hosting World Coffee Research OFT here in Kenya. As a farmer, the varieties of coffee I select is important because different varieties do well in different regions. Also, some varieties like Ruiru 11 and Batian are resistant to CBD and leaf rust. This lowers our cost of production and thus increase profit. We also source our seeds as a society from Calro CRI in Ruiru to be sure that we have genuine variety. This also ensures that the seedlings we plant will grow well and mature faster. Thank you.
In coffee, particularly specialty coffee, the culture of demand tends to swing on flavor and uniqueness. But how often do I consider quality with respect to how well a coffee plant can survive extreme conditions or disease? How might my purchasing decisions and Instagram posts promote or obstruct genetic security for coffee producers? In this episode, we talk about what seems to be an unpopular conversation, seeds and nurseries. Of course, this is a coffee science topic, and our guest for this episode is Craig Kraft, who is the Asia and Africa Director at World Coffee Research.
Yeah, so last time we talked, I was working for Catholic Relief Services based in Managua, Nicaragua. And 2 years ago, I joined World Coffee Research. I'm currently the director of our programs in Asia and Africa, and my current base is France. Here at WCR, this is a big area of focus for us. Since we developed the Arabica varieties catalog, we've recognized that access is also an important piece for farmers. They just don't have access to a lot of these varieties that we've talked about in the catalog.
Okay, and so that sounds like access is going to be a key part of what we end up talking about, but let's take it back a little bit and talk about what is the seed sector? What are the components that make up what we're calling the seed sector?
Sure. So the seed sector is everything kind of behind the scenes that's required to get a plant into a farmer's field. So if we go backwards from a farmer's field, we're including the nursery. Right? This may be on a farmer's farm, it might be on their farm, it may be a commercial nursery. It's the seed lot. This is a parcel of trees that are managed purely to develop seed. And then also there is the research and development that go into creating and identifying varieties that have the qualities that farmers need.
So, in your opinion, so, our listeners, they're hearing the seed sector, there's a gap in the seed sector. It sounds like there's some stuff in place. So maybe the question is, why is this so important? It sounds like there's already structure.
It's in many cases, I mean, I think I've given you an ideal scenario of what that what that looks like, what a seed sector could entail. I think in many origin countries, that sector, that structure is non-existent. The issue here is about unnecessary farmer risk, right?
Mm-hmm.
Investment in plants is one of the most important investments a farmer, he or she, can make into their farm. And oftentimes there is no assurances about what they're buying or what they're reproducing, right? If you think you have a geisha, for example, or a rust resistant variety, you are banking that you will have resistance against disease, or that you will have the potential for an amazing cup of coffee. And yet, most of the time, what you think you have isn't exactly what you're getting. One of my colleagues, Solène Prouveau, she wrote a paper, it was published about 4 months ago, on the authentication of Arabica coffee using DNA fingerprinting, right? Using microsatellite markers. And just to point out, one example of the 88 geisha samples that were sent to WCR for authentication or for testing, only 39% of those actually matched the original reference, which comes from Cartier's collection, right? This is the tree or population that the Petersons took to Panama.
Okay. Yeah.
And you go on, it's discovered at the top of the hill, and people have written books about this. So only 39% of all the samples that people had sent to WCR trying to ask, hey, is this geisha? Can you check if I have geisha?
Mm-hmm.
Only 39% matched. Another 24% were related, but they had it's like you had a cousin of geisha, right?
Okay.
It's not
Yeah.
not the same thing, but yes, it's related. And then another 37% were completely unrelated. They were Bourbon, Typica, even Catimars,
Oh, wow.
that people had mistaken for geisha and sent to us for verification. So, I mean, I think this right here gives you kind of a very concrete example of the level of sort of mixture and confusion that exists in the seed sector. And so, if you're a farmer and you want to buy geisha because you know that people are getting a great price on this, and you've got the potential for really producing a coffee that's going to get you a premium, how do you go to the marketplace and buy this, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, how do you know that even if you're propagating your own varieties, how do you really know that you also have geisha?
I see.
So I think this is it matters because I think it's a huge risk that producers face.
I guess in some worst case scenarios, you could have a producer who is taking a risk on part of their farm and saying, I'm going to plant these geishas I just bought, and they have this expectation for a return on their investment, and then it never comes because it turns out they planted a Bourbon or something terrible, right?
Exactly.
But another scenario I can think of where this could be really bad is where maybe a farmer is planting thinking they're planting a coffee variety that is resistant to rust, but it turns out it's something that's very much not resistant. And so, say rust strikes and their farm is taken out, kind of thing. So there's definitely this blindness happening that, and producers as it is already take on so much risk and have so much burden on them to just produce coffee in the first place. So yeah, it sounds like a pretty serious issue to me. What does this have to do with coffee science? We're sticking this conversation. It's become kind of prominent in the conversation for agricultural R&D, as we've been discussing with a few people at WCR and people in that world. This topic's come up again and again. What do you think it has to do with coffee science? Like, how should our listeners think about this as, like, this is a coffee science problem?
Sure. Coffee science, I think, is involved because it's provided us some tools to measure and to understand the extent of this crisis, right? We've got this DNA fingerprinting method that I just referenced and discussed. We think that coffee is predominantly selfing, right? That one coffee plant will produce seeds and bear seedlings that are identical to the genetics of the mother plant. I mean, and the issue comes is that coffee actually cross pollinates at a rate thought to be around 10 to 15%.
Is that high,
Meaning,
like in the plant world?
no, it's not. So think about corn, right? Maize.
Okay, yeah.
Maize is 100% outcrosser. You do not have viable seed unless you get pollen from a different plant.
Okay.
Whereas coffee, Jesse, if you had a coffee plant at your home,
Which I do, by the way.
and it
Before we continue, let's do a quick review of fundamental genetics thanks to Khan Academy. They're not a sponsor, but they are a heck of a great resource for learning. All kinds of things, actually. I'm not a geneticist, so please consider the following with a healthy dose of skepticism. Picture DNA as a straight line. A section on that line is a gene. That gene is responsible for something like flower color. For example, this plant's flower is violet, and that plant's flower is white. The variation of that gene responsible for either color is what we call an allele. Again, DNA as a line, section of DNA is a gene, variant of that gene is a specific variation we call an allele. This allele causes violet. That allele causes white. This is important because Craig is about to say something about a fixed line, which is referring to genetic conditions where, say, I have a plant in isolation whose seeds produce an exact copy of itself. Hashtag, I'm not a geneticist, and hashtag, call me out if I flubbed something really bad there. All right, back to the conversation.
There you go, right? It flowers, it produces seed. That seed is viable,
Oh, okay.
right? And you can be assured that if you have a fixed line variety, the seeds that you plant from your coffee in your windowsill are going to be true to type. That is to say that it is 100% a copy of the plant that you had in the window.
Okay, yeah.
Right. But if you say you have 2 coffee plants in your window, there is probability that pollen from one plant, if you had a little bit of a breeze or maybe there were some insects that would transfer pollen from one plant to the other plant,
Mm-hmm.
there's a 10 to 15% chance, this is what some of the science says, that they will cross. In other words, from every 100 seeds that you have, 90 would be true to type from the mother.
Okay, yeah.
And 10 might be crosses with the other plant.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
So if we can think back to our intro to genetics and he's Belgian monk, right? Gregor Mendel, who looked at peas and how inheritance worked. You would have a new plant then that would be half plant A and half plant B. This is a hybrid, but then when that plant selfs, you no longer have the same plant. You would have, it segregates into 4. So what people call Bourbon it's not always a really clear genetic homogeneous group, right? It is a group, but there's a lot of diversity within it. Think about the horticultural crops that we put into our garden, right? You can go to the nursery and you buy a packet of hybrid seeds. These are seeds made from crossing one line to another, disease resistant. People know what the outcomes of those crosses are going to be. We don't have that in most of the world for coffee.
I see. Yeah, like you can purchase whatever bag of seeds, and you look on the back, it tells you exactly what's going on. You can expect that to be exactly what you end up with. And there's not that assurance in the coffee sector.
WCR and NSF a few years ago started an initiative called WCR Verified, where we were trying to provide that same level of certification and quality assurance on nurseries and seed lots, but the same sort of protection that consumers in the United States or Europe would have when they buy seeds. We were trying to extend those same things in countries that lack that level of regulation and oversight. The investment in the development of new varieties and the levels of sort of regulation and sophistication of these seed sectors are very different across the origins where coffee is grown. So places that are more sophisticated and have more levels of investment, I think are also the same origins we think of in terms of high levels of productivity.
Okay.
Colombia, Honduras, Brazil, Vietnam, all of these countries have made investments in research and development. They understand what varieties they want to propagate and what their farmers should be growing or want to be growing. And they have made sort of massive replantations happen. And they are some of the most productive coffee growing countries in the globe. And then in other countries that lack this same sort of vision and investment, we have a lot of other issues. I mean, El Salvador a few years ago distributed millions of plants that they thought were rust resistant, yet many of them weren't. And they also arrived at farmers' fields in poor condition. And so our focus is really on the countries that need this type of assistance. This WCR Verified, I think, is less important for a country like Colombia than it would be for Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, some of the, in East Africa.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like coffee in general, just through the conversations I've been having, is behind other ag products globally in general in research. And you and I have talked about this. I mean, that's kind of what the last episode we shared together was about, was a gap in coffee research. But it sounds like what you're saying now is even inside the coffee sector, you can kind of look at the countries that are more productive and say, hey, their seed sector is probably more strong or stronger than a seed sector elsewhere where production is lower. Is that sort of the mindset?
Yeah, and I think if we try to compare coffee to other agricultural crops in the seed sector, these annual crops or row crops in the United States that get planted, soy, cotton, corn, they're planted year in, year out, and companies recognized there was opportunity to make profit.
Mm-hmm.
They invested in developing seed with superior performance, and that private investment then pays off when they sell this seed to the farmer year in, year out. And you look at what's happened to the yields of maize and soy in the United States, and it's boomed, right? And this goes hand in hand with sort of the development of the seed sector for both corn and maize.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not to say that it is completely 100% positive story. There's definitely concerns about dependence on a private sector for your seed, and there have been sort of counter movements of different groups working on ensuring access to seed and the ability to save seed, right? So I just want to acknowledge that side as well.
Yeah.
Represents a lot of investment into research and development and bringing those seeds all the way to farmers. If we look at coffee, we're not planting coffee every year. You're not replanting your entire farm every year. The most aggressive farmers in Latin America replant every 7 to 10 years, but most farmers, maybe they do this once every 25 years or longer, right?
Yeah.
There's not the same, private companies don't look at this and say, oh, there's an opportunity for us to make some profit. And I mean, there are a few examples, back in Nicaragua, Ecom entered into a couple interesting partnerships with CIRAD, which is the French Agricultural Development Agency, and they found public money to support new varietal development, right? These are the origins of a lot of the hybrids that are found now in Central America, right? The H1, H3. And so Ecom recognized that in order for them as a company in Costa Rica and Nicaragua to be able to continue to provide coffee to their customers, they needed to address this risk to their supply chain. And so they found an interesting way to leverage public funding for the development of new varieties in Central America. So, and that's to them, they're not making money. They're not making money on selling seed.
Yeah.
Rather, they recognize that in 3 to 5 years' time, they're going to have more coffee to sell from their producers. They're reducing the risk to they're reducing the risk to their supply of coffee.
Yeah.
And I think this is a sort of a key point here, right? Farmers are facing, it's not just farmers that face the risk, it's really a risk that is shared up the supply chain, but obviously a farmer at an individual level is, he or she feels it much more than a trader might who's got, thousands of farmers to buy from.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or access to switch farmers. It's, when things get bad.
Exactly.
Yeah. 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 It's a really interesting issue. And I think this is sort of a more nuanced way of talking about the risk, sort of long term, the bigger picture of saying, the seed sector issue is a problem, not just for the producer. It's just more immediate for the producer. And yeah, there's definitely a lot more there, I think, to investigate. But for sake of time, what do you think change looks like with respect to this problem, the seed sector? And what kinds of players do you think need to be in what kinds of roles?
Yeah, I mean, this is what we're trying to, this is what WCR is trying to do. We're trying to create change here. And I think it depends. This is the scientist's favorite answer, right? It depends.
Yeah.
It depends on the context. I think, if you talk to people that work in Ethiopia, or there's other origins where farmers they have a hard time even with just sort of pruning their tree. So the idea that they would need to destroy a tree that is somewhat productive and replace it with another tree is a huge sort of, it's a huge step for them in terms of the way that they've traditionally managed their coffee field. And so on one piece, I think it's about education. It's about understanding the role that coffee plays in this farmer's livelihood strategy. How do we inform farmers of their risks that they're facing when they replant or when they don't replant? And then the other piece is, I think, what ecom was doing is pretty innovative. I think we need to get ways to share the risk across the supply chain. I think, the goal and the hope with WCR Verified, the idea was that if we can find ways to share the risk, say, Jesse, you are renovating your coffee farm, and your ability to access a loan at good terms is contingent on you using, verified coffee varieties, right? So that way, the people that are financing your renovation know that you are planting with the best material available out there. It reduces your risk as a farmer, it reduces your lender's risk, and it reduces the risk to the supply chain that they're not going to have coffee when they need it.
Yeah.
Right. So if everyone is linked in this idea of trying to reduce risk down the lane, then I think change happens a little faster, right?
Mm-hmm.
The farmer is more incentivized to make a change and renovate, knowing that those are better terms for the loan, right? Knowing that someone is going to buy my coffee later on, knowing that I'm getting the best possible variety and it's true to type.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah.
for us, we got to work with different groups to sort of recognize the problem and align sort of the incentives that are there, because I think there's really a strong business case to be made for promoting good varieties for farmers to plant. WCR Verified hasn't really taken off as we thought for a number of reasons, like origins that have already sort of established strong R&D and seed sectors are pumping out varieties that are more and more productive.
Yeah.
So if you haven't gotten on the train, you're falling even further behind.
Yeah. Yeah, I could see the perspective being that, that's kind of competitive advantage of some kind, where the regions or countries where the government and the NGOs and everybody's kind of work together to reinforce that seed sector look like they're just going to come out on top. And it sounds like too, like the importance of varieties that are resistant or that are more pure are going to be critical for when climate continues. I mean, that's really the clock that's ticking constantly.
So we're talking about 10 to 15 years of a lag.
Yeah.
And that's in a seed system or sector where things are working fairly quickly, right? In a sort of dysfunctional seed sector, it's going to be very difficult to introduce new varieties that are climate resilient or climate resistant to farmers in a sort of efficient way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that we've kind of covered some of the questions I was going to go through just naturally through conversation, which is really nice. And we're coming to the close of our conversation as well. I see I didn't update this question 11 for you, but is there anything else you want to speak to on the seed sector before we go into the closing questions?
So another example, I think, where your listeners might be able to see varieties highlighted is definitely in the Cup of Excellence. In Nicaragua this last year, a number of the winners were 5 of the top lots were Maracatura hybrid, which is thought to be a cross between Maragogipe and Catura and found only in sort of Nicaragua at the moment. So I think, there are places where on the kind of consumption side, you will see where different varieties are definitely being pushed forward for their high levels of quality, and that, the idea that there is a value proposition for the roaster and the farmer for highlighting these varieties, right? So, I mean, I think, part of this is just recognizing this and being kind of aware of that. Like, what does that mean when you want a certain variety, right? What sort of risk are we transferring back onto the farmer when we only want Caturra or only want Bourbon? We only want these tasty varieties that aren't rust resistant, right? There's a little level of risk that we're transferring back to the farmer. And it would be great if your listeners thought of that the next time they had a cup of Bourbon.
What Craig said here got to me. We already know from many hours of content on the Coffee Podcast that coffee producers take on the majority of risk when making a decision about the future of coffee. I have to wonder if I have been a part of promoting unnecessary additional risk to farmers by demanding certain coffees with conversations or even purchases I make for coffee if I subscribe to the vote with dollars idea. So I asked Craig, what should we take away from this conversation? How should it affect the way we think?
Understanding that the purchase of plants is a critical investment for farmers. There is a crisis in many origin countries in the seed sector about the poor quality and mislabeled varieties that come out. And what we're trying to do is decrease the risk that producers face. As you mentioned, producers already bear an enormous amount of risk due to climate and price. And now seeds, we want to make sure that they have the best tools possible at their disposal to be able to deal with the crises that are yet to come.
This is just one of a few episodes we're going to have in the Coffee Science series on the topic of coffee ag R&D, specifically about the seed sector. So stay tuned because there's a lot to learn here. I normally go at producing these episodes all by my lonesome, and I want to give a huge thank you to Greg Minahan, who helped me really cut down this episode to a nice bite-sized piece so we can have a great introduction into the topic of the seed sector. If you haven't had the pleasure of meeting Greg Minahan, I recommend that you go find him on LinkedIn, reach out to him, say, "Hello, Greg." I'll post a connection to his LinkedIn on the website at thecoffeepodcast.com. Thanks for tuning in. And as always, and until next time, happy brewing.